Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to the C20 Summit. My name is Blair Glencourse. I run an organization called the Accountability Lab, and I'm also the co-chair of the C20 Anti-Corruption Working Group this year. The Civil 20, the C20, as you know, is an independent engagement group of the G20 and is a global platform for civil society organizations to make their voices heard by world leaders at the G20. There's over 1,000 CSOs as part of this group now from all over the world. And this is the biggest C20 summit to date. And the inputs that we are developing through these conversations from our speakers and from you, the audience, contribute directly to our efforts to influence the G20 leaders' agendas going forward. So this is an important conversation, an important time, and an important process. You can still register if you're not already a member of the C20 through the C20 website to be part of this. We encourage you to attend other events and other conversations throughout the next few days. There's a number touching on issues of anti-corruption and accountability and citizen participation and other issues that we're going to be talking about today as well. And so please leave your comments in the chat, ask us questions. We want this to be as interactive as it can possibly be. The hashtag for the summit and for this panel is C20 Summit. And so please also get on social media. We want this to be a bigger conversation beyond those that can join us right here as well. And the recordings and the summaries of these sessions will be shared afterwards and given to the relevant G20 working groups as well. So this is a great opportunity for us to talk about these issues today. And the issues are around ICTs, technology, and corruption. This is, of course, a critical issue. As part of the anti-corruption working group this year, we put together a whole series of proposals for the G20 to consider around corruption, and ICTs and corruption were one of them. I think this is important right now for a couple of really important issues. Of course, it's the COVID-19 related time now. It's a critical moment, I think. The cause of this pandemic, I would argue, is corruption. It's not just a symptom. Corruption for many years has allowed the evasion of environmental standards. It's gutted health systems. It's undermined trust in governments. Even in normal times, corruption in the health sector costs about $500 billion a year, or as much as 30% of health budgets. Now I would argue that's even more. We're seeing price gouging, we're seeing fraudulent transactions, we're seeing improper procurement, we're seeing closing civic space, and all sorts of other issues during this period. And ICTs are, of course, one way that we can think about combating corruption. In our paper that we put to the G20 a few months ago, we talked about how ICTs can be used to make data more open, how information systems can be used to register emergency response funds. We talked about e-procurement platforms. We talked about open government principles that could guide the development of ICT systems, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot that we can do. And I think now is a critical time over the next 6 months, not only with this summit and with the first ever ministerial meeting within the G20 on anti-corruption, which is coming up in a few weeks. But there is, for those of you that follow these things, a couple of big anti-corruption conferences early next year. There's something called the Crime Congress. There's a UN special session on corruption. So now is the time, I think, to be having this conversation. And today we're lucky enough to be joined by some real experts on these issues. So I'm going to ask them very briefly to introduce themselves. Elena, over to you first. Do you want to briefly say hello and explain who you are and what you do?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Elena Calistru from an organization called Funky Citizens. I'm somewhere in an airport right now, so I'm one of the few persons that are probably still lucky enough to travel. My organization is dealing with civic tech, amongst other things, and with good governance. And I would say that we have plenty of experience in working with both other civil society organizations, as well as with people like investigative journalists when it comes to using ICT tools for the fight against corruption, especially in public procurement, public budgets, and everything related to the public sphere.
Thank you, Elena. And Laura, over to you. Would you like to quickly introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Blair, for the invitation. It's a great honor to share this panel session with Alan and Lena. My name is Laura Reina. I run an organization that is called Puentec, a laboratory for tech policy in Latin America. We work on address the challenges of the fourth industrial revolution into policymakers, and working closely with Latin American startups on their tech policy challenges too. Such a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you, Laura. And Alan, over to you. Would you like to quickly introduce yourself?
G'day, hi. My name is Alan Wu. I'm a Senior Regional Coordinator at the Open Government Partnership, which is a multilateral initiative to advance reforms to make governments more accountable, inclusive, and responsive. I'm based in Singapore and help manage the participation of a number of Asia-Pacific countries as well as some European countries into the partnership. And prior to that, I was a lawyer with the Australian government.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alan. And to all of you listening, like I said, please leave comments or questions in the chat box. The other thing I'd love to hear from you is if you have examples of good tech tools that are being used to fight corruption, post those links in the chat box. Let's curate a library of these as we go along through the conversation. So let me start first, Elena, with you. Tell us a bit more about how you're using technology to fight corruption and engage citizens, and the kind of challenges and successes that you've had with these approaches.
Well, it is a very long story because it is usually a struggle, especially in countries that do not necessarily have a tradition in being so open, because technology is, or the first step towards using technology for anti-corruption or promoting open government, transparency, and so on, relies strongly on a culture of openness. And this is something that in a country like Romania, and actually for a lot of other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, is not pre-existing. I started working first on, or advocating for, opening the data related to public budgets, and I must admit that I'm still amazed how this is still an issue. So the bare access to open data is still an issue when it comes to public spending, and I'm talking here both about budgets and about public procurement in so many countries. These dark circles are the effect of many nights of trying to make PDFs, scanned PDFs, more operational and making them available to both citizens and to journalists, while trying to advocate or while trying to make the point that open data is the first step towards fighting corruption or preventing corruption in public spending. In these years, I have found many other organizations, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. We are part of a civic tech organizations coalition called Transparency EE, and we together we've developed some tools that use ICT for fighting corruption, but we also managed to somehow borrow and replicate some of the tools developed by other countries in this regard. And I'm going to give you just one example, which might be a bit let's say, more sophisticated than if we are to compare it with my initial struggles to just make some PDFs open and easy to manipulate for analysis. I'm talking here about the platform called Tenders Guru. The project is called Record, but the ICT platform is called Tenders.guru. It is a platform that is covering Romania, Hungary, Poland, and Spain. A platform which is basically using data, ICT to make procurement data available for everybody, and in particular for investigative reporters. We have also developed a series of red flags that can point to corruption vulnerabilities when it comes to direct contracting, for example. And we've also managed to make this data available, and the results of the analysis available in a comparative view, in order to have, let's say, a bigger picture when it comes to what is happening with corruption vulnerabilities in all the countries I have mentioned. On the other hand, one of the struggles we have right now, especially since the start of the COVID-19 crisis, is not only to have the basics available. I'm talking here about access to data, but also about making use of everything related to big data or big chunks of public information in order to see what is happening when in a situation in which the public allocations for fighting COVID-19 have been really, let's say, relaxed, which means that the corruption vulnerabilities are even higher than they used to be. And because when we're talking about COVID-19, we're always mentioning pre-existing conditions as a factor that makes the patients even more vulnerable. I would say that when it comes to corruption, pre-existing weaknesses in transparency, in dealing with corruption is also making these countries more vulnerable when dealing with a pandemic. And for example, what we've worked on recently is actually a platform for whistleblowers, especially from whistleblowers that are coming from the healthcare sector. We are developing this with the help of our platform partners from TechSoup Global, and this is also something that is helping us provide a proper mix of big data interventions, like dealing with huge procurement data, ICT solutions, and micro data that is coming from whistleblowers, and these whistleblowers also need ICT solutions that ensure them proper security of the data that they are sharing with us and with investigative reporters, as well as, of course, anonymity and due protection in front of potential threats that could come. So, I would say that if I were to draw a line with regards to what ICT, the use of ICT for the fight against corruption, and in particular the fight against corruption in dealing with public funds meant to us, is I could say that in my opinion, we always need to have a due balance between sophisticated tools that can help, especially if we're talking about about comparative analysis, if we're talking about big data, if we're talking about information that can paint a bigger picture of the systemic vulnerabilities to corruption, but that we should also use ICT for basic access and basic analysis of data. Because at least in my experience, you can often do a lot, but I mean really a lot with just a simple spreadsheet and with a due filter in that spreadsheet, and actually empower communities or empower journalists to expose corruption in this way. And the prerequisite there is the actual access to data.
Thank you, Elena. Really interesting, and great point there at the end. I think we tend to think about ICTs as always the most advanced and innovative technologies, but actually it's not always those at the forefront of of design and thinking. It's very simple tools that can also be useful. I had a very quick follow-up question for you, Elena, around this point about open data and whether transparency automatically leads to accountability. Are you seeing, for example, the kind of procurement data that you're gathering through the tenders.guru platform being used meaningfully to improve processes and really make decision makers more accountable, or is open data enough on its own?
Well, it depends. And if you want me to start complaining right now, I could say that especially when it comes to direct contracting, and this happened a lot in many, I don't know about other places in the world. As far as I know, the situation has been rather the same. But in Europe, there were very flexible regulations with regards to what a government can procure directly without following the public procurement legislation. And what I can tell you is that through Tenders Guru, the journalists we've worked with, some journalists we've worked with, managed to identify some almost clear corruption cases, which meant that we were even sued by some local authorities, which were not very happy about the things we have uncovered. We've won that case, which might mean that the use of ICT is actually sometimes really helpful with exposing this kind of data. However, what I could say is that for many people that we work with, for many journalists, for many citizens groups or CSOs, the past few months meant going back to square one when it comes to ICT, meaning going back to putting all the efforts into FOIA requests and basic access to information. So to come back to your question, I would say that ICT tools are helping, and we can see this from the reaction of authorities. But however, this doesn't mean that, especially during times of crisis when rules are more relaxed, some authorities won't take the chance to actually make some steps back when it comes to access to the data that provides us with or that feeds into the tools that we have developed.
Great, and I think you're bringing up another really interesting point here about the role of civil society and what role we can play in all of this. It sounds like you're, to a large degree, acting not just as a technologist, but also as an intermediary and as someone that is translating data in different ways to citizens and to governments, and an advocate and other roles too. So I think we can all think about where we fit in all of this. But I wanted to move on to Laura. Laura, you've done some really interesting things in Mexico, I think, with local government, now with your current organization and thinking about tech policy. Tell us a bit more about what you've been doing and how you think ICTs can help fight corruption.
Sure, Blair. If you allow me, I made a presentation around the subject for anyone who is connecting and trying to understand this subject, for the people who are getting to know this for the first time, and to answer the question that was raised for the panel. Well, as you mentioned, and as I mentioned before, I run ICT Lab. You can get into the page. We make information around tech policy in Spanish. So for the people who don't speak Spanish, they're sorry. But the idea is around to understand three main ideas to answering what you just mentioned is understand the types of interventions that were mentioned by Elena. How is it used? What tools are around, and some of the lessons that we see in ICT Lab that we could actually, I think, implement not only for Latin America, but I will be interested on hearing their opinion on other parts of the world. But just first, like a concern. GovTech and specifically the use of ICTs against corruption has generated a lot of expectations and a lot of investment. But Transparency International and many organizations are asking for the results now. Like, we've been talking and discussing around this, but we don't know exactly what are the main results. There's a lot of studies, but this is important to know because the investment, for example, of GovTech will reach 1 trillion by 2025. So we are talking about the government being the power purchaser and the main input of not the main, but very important input for technology companies around investment. So there are a lot of benefits around the subject, as Elena mentioned before, and as the documents that were shared by Open Society right now, for example, answering some of the questions around COVID-19 and emergency use of financial of finances and money for this type of challenges. But the GovTech initiatives or the technology by itself was not generated to address or to anti-corruption, but benefits are expected. And I mentioned here some of them. A lot of studies around one of World Bank, and I can share it to you at the end if you are further into reading into more of these ideas. But the thing is, after we understand that there's these expectations, and there are a lot of ways to have intervention. So first, how is it used? There are three main ways. The first one is the transactional reforms. It's all the idea to control and automate government processes, restrict discretion of officials, and increase the detection of corruption. All these ideas around, for example, using online services, online rights to information, crowdsourcing, reporting. There are a lot of examples for this, but the idea is to understand like the three main ways that exist. The other ones are transparency reforms that focus on opening up the state, increasing the flow of information from government to citizens, making the actions from the state and its action agents more visible to citizens, civil society, the private sector. And the third one that was expressed by Elena, and it was to express voice. And it's from upwards accountability and from downwards accountability. And this idea has led, for example, a lot of movements around the world use social media, use technology to empower themselves and evidentiate something that after investigating through the transparency reforms that governments start by using technology, organizations have this information and then go to social media or use technology, all sorts of technology tools to address or to show a subject. So is there a causal correlation between the use of ITC and corruption? In my opinion, the context matters. Because it depends on the country, it depends on the initiative, it depends on how do people understand what technology is, if they know how to use it, from where the technology was based. For example, in Latin America, we just hit the first unicorn company by our own tech developed by Latin America. And normally, the idea of the centralization of the technologies are developed in the United States, in UK, in European Union, India, China, were principal countries where technology was developed. And now we see that they're emerging on other parts of the world that are developing their own technologies. So this is just a small case, but context matters. And for example, just a real everyday case life. In Mexico, due to COVID-19, obviously the classes were interrupted. So many classes went online. But the thing is that women and due to the inequalities of a developing country, women had to go out to the main squares so their kids could do their homework. And so they had to miss their jobs. And it depends on this specific situation in a pandemic, of all the challenges and all the upsides and downsides that technology can have. So as I mentioned, it will depend. So can ITCs be used against corruption? Well, it depends. So first, to understand what type of initiative, as I mentioned, and also what type of tools. And I'm going faster now. So these are like all the tools that I see. I'm not going to go deep on each one of them, but there is GovTech and all that one of my colleagues from Open Society can go into deep more, but the automatization of processes. But it's important to mention that more technology is not more political engagement necessarily. So, for example, in human resources, to be more open into who is working for the government and how they are using budgets or how social services are done. The other side is use of open data, for example, the use of artificial intelligence or mobile data portals to analyze information that is published by governments and then understand a challenge. The other part, as we mentioned before, is social media. And my thesis research I published in 2012, and I was talking about the emergence of a global civil society thanks to social media. So I think that today this is a great example of how this is happening thanks to C20. And but the challenges that I saw then, and I think there are today, it's hard to address long-lasting change. So what comes next with new technologies such as the ones in the fourth industrial revolution? For those who don't know the subject, there are 12 main technologies that WEF is talking about in this. So from the next steps, the lessons for me is to first talk more about inclusion, more about the risk, and more about the ethics. And an important voice for Mexico, it's an important change in leadership on how do they understand the use of technology for change. For example, today, right now in Mexico, the president has decided to eliminate all the public fundings for science, technology, COVID-19, and address it and that there were before, thanks to transparency and thanks to open data, published on government portals. And right now, there is a big battle in the Mexican Congress right now. If you are on Twitter and you can know Spanish or use the translator, #Fideicomis SOS. All the scientific organizations are, this is how they voted yesterday, one part of the legislation. So thanks to technology, we're all technology, we can see which of the legislators voted against and in favor of it, and we will be taking count of them. That was not easy to do years before, but we need this idea of understanding responsibility, adaptation, and strategy from our leaders. And just to keep in mind this, access, use, capacity, and your own data. And thank you very much. And I will leave my intervention to here, but if you want to discuss more about it, this is my information.
Thank you, Laura. You covered a lot of ground there. Really interesting. A couple of quick follow-up questions for you. And one is about inclusion and gender in particular. I know this is a particular theme of your work. How are these tools affecting women differently versus men, or people with other gender identities? How are they engaging in different ways with these kinds of tools? Are they gendered in the right sorts of ways or not? Or how would you talk to that?
Yeah, last year with Global Shapers from Mexico, we made a study around the inequalities on gender wage gap in technology industry. So women in Mexico, just for being in this area, earn 30% less. And this has made that the development of technology and the women in tech are not focused on the half of the population for one side. And on the other side, it's this idea that also the use of technology right now, for example, as I put on the case, it was really famous that women are in Mexico on the news, that women were the one who were not being, one of the national policies was also for schools, was to put on television the programs for schooling. So if you were on elementary school, you will be from 5 to 7 a.m. and so on. So if you had 4 kids, you will need 4 televisions or 4 computers, and so to whom are you going to give the only television or the only computer or the only access to technology? And if this goes in the first ages, like when you're a kid, and you see these differences between your gender. So whenever we are talking about developing leaders that understand the challenges and leaders who have a more inclusive leadership, and for example, voting again in favor of eliminating budget and public budget for science and technology right now, it will be the case. And in particular, for corruption, it will be the less number of women addressing to the challenges of violence. For example, it also before in this year was canceled the budget for women, and we could know this, that the budget was not used for addressing women violence because the government before the one that was right now left open data information around the use of the budgets. So it's important, like the tools, and like women in organizations saw this because we could study this with open data and express it to the government and making the fight that we can.
Great. And one other quick follow-up question around skills. I mean, you're a young person in this industry. Are young people now developing the right kinds of skills to keep up with the way that technology is evolving and the tools that we need to fight corruption, or where could they learn those skills, and what kind of skills do they need?
Well, this is a great concern that we have for ICT Lab. For example, to study tech policy in Latin America, there are no places to do it. So I have to come to the UK, to Cambridge, to study this subject. And also there's not a lot of information in Spanish. So there's the barrier of language. So we are making in Puentec information in Spanish, so people from different areas could raise their hand and say, hey, I'm interested in developing a career in tech. Also understanding that careers in tech are not all from tech backgrounds, that we need more people, for example, in ethics, philosophy, social sciences, who understand the challenges in tech policy. But it's important also to mention, to think more about the future of work and education in this context, and to understand that this generation has embraced the idea of adapting yourself into a new area. I worked in government 10 years, and now I'm in technology for 2 years now. And I don't know where I want to be when I'm in my 40s. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Alan, I want to turn to you. I know you have some slides. Please, over to you. Tell us a bit more about how you're thinking about ICTs and corruption and the challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, thanks, Blair. So I'm Alan Wu, Senior Regional Coordinator at the Open Government Partnership. I'll talk a little bit about how OGP works and how we can use the platform to advance anti-corruption work domestically and around the world, and then some examples from OGP countries that have used technology to fight corruption, and some brief reflections on their experiences. So on to the next slide. So the Open Government Partnership is a multilateral initiative that brings together government reformers and civil society leaders to create action plans that make governments more accountable, inclusive, and responsive to the people they serve. We focus on reforms that promote transparency, fight corruption, empower citizens, and harness new technologies to improve governance. The OGP was formally launched in September 2011 by 8 founding governments and 9 civil society leaders. And today, in the spirit of multi-stakeholder collaboration, OGP continues to be overseen by a steering committee, including representatives of governments and civil society organizations. The OGP process works like this diagram here. Countries that meet minimum eligibility criteria are able to join the partnership. Upon joining, governments and civil society work together to co-create open government commitments. These are concrete, time-bound reforms to open up government over a 2-year horizon. Then over the implementation period, government, again with the assistance of civil society, implements its commitments. Ongoing consultation with civil society on implementation, monitoring, and reporting is part of that process, and governed by participation and co-creation standards that require the formation of a joint steering committee called the Multi-Stakeholder Forum. Participating countries are also expected to share their experiences with other governments and stakeholders, and to seek to learn from the experiences of their peers. They may also participate in peer learning with other open government member countries. And lastly, the government self-assesses its own performance. It's also independently validated by OGP's independent reporting mechanism. So the next slide. Here's a breakdown of some of the numbers across the 9-year-old partnership. Notably, there are 13 G20 members that are currently members of OGP, and that includes our current steering committee co-chair, South Korea. Our steering committee also includes several civil society leaders who play a key role in the global anti-corruption G20 discussions, including, of course, Blair himself. So we think OGP is unlike many other initiatives in three key ways. First, it guarantees a seat for civil society, both at the international level, the composition of its steering committee, and at the national level, where governments are required to consult and ideally collaborate with civil society in defining national open government priorities and plans. Second, we're action-oriented. While there's a recognition that different countries are at different starting points when it comes to open government, all countries are expected to stretch ambition and make progress on an ongoing basis. We don't prescribe standards for openness that countries should follow, nor specify sectors to target. Instead, our context-specific approach is designed to bring governments and civil society of each country together to define their own priorities for reform, learning from and inspiring each other along the way. The support unit assists the design, implementation, and sharing of meaningful commitments by working with a constellation of partners, including multilateral partners, the World Bank, OECD, UNDP, Asian Development Bank, to facilitate peer exchanges, leverage financial and technical assistance, and provide support for the collaborative OGP process. And third, the process and its entirety is subject to both self-assessment by countries, but also independent monitoring, a key feature which ensures members are held to account for what they commit to do. So what does this look like in practice? Over the years, thematic areas of collective ambition have emerged in OGP, and these include anti-corruption, public service delivery, public participation, and civic space. Given today's topic, let me focus on anti-corruption. To date, 91 countries across the partnership and subnational members across the partnership have made a total of 722 anti-corruption commitments, including enhancing beneficial ownership transparency, strengthening anti-corruption institutions, and promoting corruption-free procurement. Many of these leverage the possibility of new technologies in opening up government, enhancing the ability of civil society organizations to oversee government activity, particularly public spending, at a scale that's been previously unimagined. And at the same time, with 3.6 billion people remaining offline, including far more women than men, we're clear-eyed about the need to ensure safeguards and manage the downsides of technology projects, including unequal access, intrusions into privacy and other rights, and the spread of disinformation. Here are some examples of OG commitments from countries within and outside the G20 that have used technology to fight corruption. So first of all, budget transparency. South Africa ranks very high in budget transparency, but use of the data has been low. In response, government and civil society reformers built an online open budget portal called Vulekamali. The portal improves access to budget information at the national and provincial levels. The portal also hosts public procurement data, and when the pandemic hit, information on the 5 billion rand response package was added too. But the critical element of the reform is how it's building a robust ecosystem of engaged users. The reform has conducted widespread public outreach efforts, including civic information drives with community groups and hackathons and data drives with activists and journalists. Over 2 years, the team engaged directly with thousands of citizens across all 9 provinces, in addition to the significant reach via the portal itself. This helps empower citizens and civil society with credible data to interrogate and influence public resource allocation. It also saw greater participance of marginalized rural South Africans, especially women and young people. And as a second example in this area, we've all seen the technology used to strengthen accountability across responses of unprecedented scale to the pandemic. So Senegal, Mexico, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Argentina, and Brazil are using the OGP process to track how massive pandemics-related stimulus packages and foreign aid are spent and ensure safety net measures reach those who need them. On open contracting, so in the aftermath of the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine in 2014, young reformers and activists vowed to tackle capture of public procurement, including by oligarchs. Leveraging the OGP action plan, they built 2 online platforms, ProZorro and DoorZorro, where all contracts which were previously shrouded in secrecy and handed out backroom deals are now disclosed in open data standards so citizens can search them and, importantly, report violations. In 2 years, citizens reported 14,000 violations, with over half publicly resolved. The government saved $1 billion. 82% of entrepreneurs surveyed reported reduced corruption from the use of the platform, and there was a 50% increase in businesses, including small and medium enterprises, bidding for public contracts for the first time. So galvanized by such results, over 70 OGP countries have committed to open contracting. Next, in overseeing infrastructure projects. In Kaduna, Nigeria, the government wanted to improve infrastructure development. They created a tech platform called Eyes and Ears to disclose data on government projects so citizens could monitor infrastructure. But they realized the tech platform alone could not solve the problem by releasing the government data. So again, they built a stronger ecosystem around the tool by inviting civil society organizations, journalists, and citizens to monitor government projects through a smartphone app that allowed photos of sites to be uploaded and expanded their engagement to also allow feedback by text messaging, phone hotlines, and social media. And as a second example, in the Philippines, the government introduced a project to use existing technologies such as satellites, drones, and geotagging in monitoring the status, program activities of big-ticket government infrastructure projects. Using the OGP platform, relevant government agencies work with civil society, journalists, and private sector representatives to take a step further by institutionalizing this process as a public accountability mechanism by involving citizens in the process and ensuring that monitoring doesn't only secure government purposes, but also the wider public. This would result not only in increased government savings, but also increased public trust. And lastly, as an example on participatory budgeting, following widespread anti-austerity protests in 2011, a group of engineers and civic activists in Madrid, Spain, developed an open source tool called Consult to organize themselves. Some of the group joined government and they used this to see their Madrid platform to bolster civic participation to address elite capture of the policy-making process, for example, by introducing participatory budgeting that funded citizen priorities, from improving integration of the multimodal transport system to support to women's shelters, to reforesting large parking lots and preserving green spaces. These reformers then took to CIDE Madrid to dozens of municipalities across Spain and to other countries, including many across the Open Government Partnership. So those are some inspiring success stories that demonstrate the progress that is possible even in challenging circumstances, when civil society coordinates well and when governments work with them in good faith. I think there are a few lessons we can learn from these actions, and these reaffirm some of the comments by previous speakers. I mean, one is that the impact of digital tools is only going to be as strong and beneficent as the social systems on which they're built. So too often, technology designed by those in power will ultimately function to serve their own interests. If conversely, we want to use technology to hold those in power to account, we must begin with transparency, participation, inclusion, and accountability in mind, and operationalize these considerations throughout the design and implementation of new tools. And secondly, this means that online tools and platforms will very frequently have to be complemented by other ways of engagement and access, because the backend system that can only be accessed in a certain way or meaningfully by certain people won't live up to its promise of being a tool for people everywhere. It's imperative that ordinary people be able to understand and access the tools that are built in a way that makes sense and seems natural to them. Ultimately, if we can build digital public goods with the people at the table that will benefit from them, and in partnership with governments, civil society, technologists, and regulators, we have the potential to build a better version of democracy that better enables accountability for government spending, meets the needs of citizens, and shows the value of open, liberal democracy in an area when it is too frequently come under attack. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan. So many good examples in there and useful reflections. I'm on the steering committee of OGP, so I'm obviously a big fan of what you're trying to do. But could you tell us a bit more about how these lessons are being shared across countries, how OGP facilitates that process? I mean, there's so much good knowledge here, and one of the challenges with all of this, of course, is that it can become stovepiped and isn't shared in ways that others can learn from. How is OGP doing that?
Yeah, so there are a variety of mechanisms, and as you would appreciate, over 9 years of commitments and 42,000 commitments that have been developed now, we have a wealth of data of what can work in different contexts, and we hope to share that in many different ways. So the support unit, the sort of secretariat, facilitates a variety of different knowledge sharing mechanisms between OGP countries and civil society organizations that are involved in the process. These involve specific ad hoc peer exchanges, more ongoing thematic leadership groups, such as one that the UK recently founded on beneficial ownership, as well as regional events and a global summit. The global summits are quite large. They're often attended by 2,000-3,000 people. The next one is in South Korea, our current co-chair, and will be held late next year. They're often attended by high-level political leaders, as well as leaders from civil society and reformers interested in the OGP process.
Great. And you talked about some different examples here. Some were sort of national level, some were more local. I know that the local program at OGP supporting subnational governments is really growing now, and we're seeing a lot of innovation at that level. Do you think when it comes to anti-corruption and tech and anti-corruption that there's more traction maybe at the local level versus national, or ways that it, maybe technology is being used differently, or the political will might be there to try these tools in different ways?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't have strong data on that. And our local program is undergoing some revitalization, and we're about to welcome a much larger cohort for a revitalized program later this year, after which, we'll have better data. But I think there probably is something in your suspicion that with those governments that are closer to people, that are a bit smaller, potentially less bureaucratic, they might be able to move a little bit quicker, be a little bit more responsive, and develop tools and deploy them in more innovative ways. I just suspect there's something to that, and we'll obviously see when the local program gets going properly.
Okay, brilliant. I wanted to encourage all of you watching. Please again put your questions in the comment box. Leave a comment. Use the hashtag C20 Summit on social media as well. Lots more to talk about and so many different threads to pick up in all of this. But I wanted to come back to all of you on this idea of kind of how change happens broadly. It seems like so much of what's happening these days to change systems is coming from people. It's coming from citizens' movements. It's coming from people on the streets, rather than organized civil society necessarily, or technology groups. But of course, tech groups, people like us are also working on these issues. How can we better connect these two groups of people and ensure that the kind of tools that are being created are being used by people to support and create the kind of change that they want to see? Elena, maybe back over to you. What do you think about that? If there's people's movements happening now in your part of the world, are they using tech tools, and how can we better connect them to the technologies that they need?
Well, we, as an organization, we actually work with a lot of citizens groups, and especially I would dig in deeper into your previous question as well, the one that you've asked, Alan, because I do believe that, especially during the COVID crisis at the very beginning, when nobody was actually really sure about what has to be done, what is happening, what are the capabilities, we have seen a lot of movement and a lot of organization at the level of citizens, usually through fundraising, charity, and so on and so forth, in order to try to better equip hospitals in Romania, for example. And what is really interesting is that the fact that citizens jumped in and tried to help as much as possible with dealing with the COVID crisis actually made some municipalities and some local governments more transparent and more accountable. So at least in Romania, in my particular case, we have seen more transparency and a greater level of detail when it comes to the expenditure happening during these months at this lower level. And I do believe that this is the result of a stronger pressure on behalf of citizens groups. And I would also give you a reason for hope, because another thing we have seen in Romania is that two brilliant ladies started to fundraise to build a hospital, and they built it only through small donations. They raised close to 20 million euros or something like this. And now during the COVID pandemic, they did this once again. What they did brilliantly is that they've actually, they've been very transparent with regards to every dollar that they've spent. And this set up a benchmark. This set up a benchmark for the government that will spend similar amounts of money for related infrastructure projects, hopefully. But it also set up a benchmark for citizens. They've educated citizens and citizens groups with regards to the way in which a simple technology, namely a spreadsheet in which you can see all the costs, can actually provide them with the tools to demand efficiency, better spending, and more transparency.
Thanks, Elena. I love that story. Laura, how do you feel about this? Do you have things to add from a Latin American or Mexican perspective?
Yes, around cases, for example, what I've seen due to COVID-19, it was something that happened, and I saw in Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico before COVID-19, is that the willingness of local governments to start working to solve public challenges through technology was accelerated, but with startups. It was not that they were hiring these big national or international company. And for example, a very specific case, in Puentec, we worked with Yeti, a Mexican startup with their own technology that use big data and IoT to make better the public transportation and they've been working since 2017 in Mexico. And we after working with them, we managed to have different local initiatives with local governments to use IoT to transport medical personnel or people who were going to their people from working at government to go safely on public transportation to their jobs. I can leave the web page and yeti.com, yeti.mx. But it was very interesting that the role that we played in Puentec was actually like to understand this change from leadership, to be more willing into investing on their local, national digital talent. And I think that is one important thing that after what Alan was mentioning, it's and all the different cases is where are the technologies developed, and also who is going to be the next digital innovator in GovTech in this kind of area. So what are the places or the countries that are making policies to promote these kinds of innovations, and not only in a short term, but in a long term. For example, Colombia has put themselves a project that to have 150,000 tech trained people by 2022. And for example, in Mexico, the government is taking away the computers for the public servants because of budget. And so we are in a very different ways to address COVID-19. So I think that there is an opportunity with local governments and that are being right now really overwhelmed about the challenges, so they are willing to take the step and try something.
Thanks, Laura. Alan, any thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm reminded of I think with an academic of social movements, Bill Moyer, who looked at how social change happens and defining a few different roles in that process: rebel, change agent, citizen, and reformer. And each of them have complementary roles that come into play at different parts of the social change process to raise awareness of an issue, to start thinking of possibilities, to socialize the possibilities as real policy outcomes, and then sort of enact that policy. And I, do take the point that there might not; those are often not the same people who play those roles, but are often different communities, and that there may not be a lot of communication between them in carrying the thread of that thinking through. I don't know whether actually everyone needs to even contemplate solutions along that process. I mean, I think there are very valid and useful functions served by bringing a complaint to light without any idea of how it is to be solved. But to the extent where it is necessary, I think digital platforms certainly make things much easier and increase our capability to build on the thinking that has been done before. I think because it's easier to get involved, to sort of sort yourself into one of those categories. I think it's because it's easier to document ideas and to share them. And that's something I should have said before, is in addition to all the events that OGB holds, we also have obviously a wealth of publications that analyze some of the results of the events that are progressed through our process. And lastly, it's easier to learn from international experience because of the ease of access to information. So yeah, I mean, to the extent that that thinking does need to be carried through, and it's useful to be carried through, I think the new platforms certainly make that a lot more accessible.
Thanks, Alan. And maybe coming back to you, and then Laura and Elena, please jump in too, on something that Laura brought up, which is the private sector and their role in all of this. And of course, to some degree with all of this, there are digital dependencies. There are certain very large private organizations that have developed corporate tech tools that we need to use, that we use for advocacy, and that we engage with in different ways in this kind of work. How can we as civil society remain independent while using these tools? And what are the challenges that we might face when the situation has evolved in this way, where a couple of very large corporations dominate the space in certain parts of the technology world?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting area, and one that hasn't really been cracked yet, right? But you do see increasing citizen demands on use of some of these technologies used to infringe on privacy and other rights. So, for example, Mexico has committed to creating regulations to protect citizens' privacy online and limit government access to personal data. New Zealand, France, Netherlands are looking at algorithmic transparency and the way that government uses automated decision-making in their functions. These are accountability processes that have been applied primarily to processes of government. But I think you're certainly right that if the public space now is dominated by a few big platforms that happen to be privately run, and they exercise the same level of control as a government might in other circumstances, then I think there are certainly legitimate demands for them to be regulated in similar ways. I think the challenge of civil society is to push for that, to be clear about what the complaints are and to be involved with the process very clearly and from the start as to what the solutions might be.
Thanks, Alan. Laura or Elena?
Yeah, one subject that I am been working on recently is on techplomacy. And it's one of the areas that I even published. It's also in Spanish, text around it, but it's around the idea that tech companies, for example, if you were president of the United States, Blair, that if we voted for you in a month, and then they tell you your first day you have 1 hour to meet someone, who will you meet? The president of the president of Google or the president of Honduras? So who will you put first in the meeting? So one idea that I've been working on is on techplomacy, on this idea of we need more social and global advocates, not only from governments that, for example, Denmark made their first techplomat and put on an ambassador in Silicon Valley, but we need more organizations that are addressing to these challenges, like to see more. I've seen the work that OpenGov has done, but we need more people being interested in data privacy, on tech development by their own, into accessibility, into fighting inequality, seeing all the rights behind technology. And that's what we are working on to understanding in Puentech, to understanding what are the challenges that the fourth industrial revolution are talking, because right now many of the ITC against and its fights against corruption developments are precisely on the third industrial revolution developments. But what about when we talk about blockchain, artificial intelligence, or even biotech and space? Is there corruption there? Isn't? I don't know. There are many questions that are we don't know the answers, but we need to start raising the questions through techplomacy and global organizations, starting to raise the voice, especially from countries that don't develop their own technology. for example, Latin America. And that question that you mentioned, so if I am pressing that, but I'm pressing that through the same means that they gave me for free. And so it's a really interesting question that I think it will be raised more in the following years.
Thanks, Laura. And I love the idea of tech diplomacy. I'm going to come back to you, all of you, towards the end and ask you what key messages you would have for the G20 leaders. So bear that in mind. You can do your own bit of tech diplomacy in a minute. But Elena, over to you. What would you say about this?
I would have a few things to add. One of the things that I keep on thinking of these days is that before the COVID-19 crisis started, there seemed to be a momentum for both the issues related to surveillance as well as to the issues related to climate change. It seemed like everybody was at least agreeing that these two things should be on the top of the priorities for the decision makers. I feel like, unfortunately, the COVID-19 crisis diminished a bit the importance of these issues at least on the public agenda or on the policy agenda. And I think that it is up to us as civil society organizations, as well as up to groups like the G20, to be mindful of the medium and long-term perspective when it comes to the world we want to live in. From this point of view, I would say that even though the issues related to the dominance of big tech should have been higher on our list of concerns during this month, they were somehow overshadowed by the healthcare issues and the economic impact of the pandemic. I think this can be corrected, but I think that it will take a while, because if we are to look at the discourse about the fight against corruption as well, this was also put in a corner. People or decision makers seem to prioritize the allocations and the immediate and fast responses, and it seems like money is pouring in all the vulnerable directions. But it looks like we don't talk about the obvious things these days, like surveillance, climate change, corruption allegations, and corruption vulnerabilities. But the second thing, because I'm usually in charge with optimism and with finding the good things in every situation, I would say that during this month we have seen the big tech stepping up in some situations, like, for example, when it comes to supporting independent journalism. And I think that's a good thing that should be built on.
Thank you, everyone. Really, really interesting, and clearly a key part of this conversation. I wanted to turn to the audience, because we do have one question that I think might be interesting for you to answer. The question is, could fighting corruption increase the resilience against crisis and pandemics? And how does fighting corruption impact the willingness of international investors to bring their investments to countries? So a couple of slightly different questions, but would anyone like to take that on?
Well, I can address the first one. I was reading again Homo Deus this week, and because I recall that Harari mentions pandemics on the book. And it was amazed me to identify that he said in 2015, in case of a pandemic, we will know it wasn't inevitable and that it was an human inexcusable failure, and we will ask the heads of the responsible people. So this, I don't know if it has happened yet. We have the information, we have the data, and everybody is like, what is happening, and so will increase the resilience. I don't know, we're living it right now, and there is not an answer to that question. I think we are learning in the process, and the idea is to raise, again, civil society has to raise the questions that no one is making. And around corruption and willingness to invest, well, that's true, at least in the case of Mexico, we've seen that. And we, a few years ago, the country promoted a national system against corruption that hasn't been implemented by the new government. So it's approved. We have the greatest laws around it, the greatest institutions, but the people make institutions, and the people there aren't doing it right now. They actually have to be passed through Congress, and the Congress hasn't called the election day for that. So, and in the recent appointments for national level, very important technological communications organizations, they have put people with no experience. And I believe that a type of corruption is accepting a job that you're not prepared for. And especially in these cases, in case of a pandemic, if you don't know about it, the best thing to do is, I don't know, somebody else should do it, but we don't have that kind of public servants right now. But it is important for development to have certainty on investments. And for example, the energy reform that was previously approved a few years ago, also it's turning back right now, investing more in fossil fuels. So all the investment around renewables energy that was made, it's kind of trapped in legal frameworks right now. So it's a really complicated time whenever you don't have this certainty for investors around what's going to happen in the following years.
If I may add a very short note, I wrote this very interesting blog post. I think, or at least it has one of the best titles I've seen on an article these days. It was on the IMF blog. They said something like, do whatever it takes, spend whatever it takes, but keep the receipts. I think that this will be very, very important for investors. A lot of governments are throwing money at the in the healthcare sector, in unemployment benefits and SMEs and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, the crisis mode will stop, and investors will have a look at those receipts, and they will have a look at the capacity of governments to act under pressure. Because if I were an investor, I would love to be in a country that knows how to deal with the crisis.
Thanks, Elena. Absolutely. And Alan, I mean, I think, on this, this question, could fighting corruption increase resilience against crisis and pandemics? Presumably a lot of the examples that you talked about and what OGP is doing is precisely around this. How do we take the knowledge and learning from what's going on now, not just to deal with this crisis, but also the next one?
Yes, yeah, I think that's certainly right. If Laura's going to talk about books, I think there's another one that might be relevant, The Great Leveler, which talks about how only really substantial shocks to the system, warfare, revolution, state collapse, and pandemics have led to real reductions in inequality throughout human history because they provoke such strong policy interventions afterward. And I think that you're seeing some of that now. I think part of the government response to the crisis is that a strong realization across the board that government can't do it alone, that they really need the trust and cooperation of their citizenry in order to navigate the crisis. And that means building a lot of, that will require, I think, over time, building a lot of transparency and accountability into systems that have previously not been subject to those forces. So hopefully, with that realization and with the interventions that are being made at a size and scale and speed that we haven't seen for a very, very long time, we'll see some dramatic shifts that should hopefully sort of turn us in the right direction.
Thanks, Alan. Absolutely. Another comment coming through the chat here is about changing national policies into transnational crime risks, or presumably to counter transnational crime risks such as deforestation, wildlife trafficking, those sorts of big international issues. Clearly that's true. We need to coordinate, we need to align national policies, we need to make sure that we're coming together collectively to address these transnational risks. Do you have thoughts on how technology is being used to do that? Any of these bigger risks that you're seeing in your work, and the ways that governments or civil societies are coming together to use technology to address them?
Well, I'm from the north of Mexico, from the border with Texas, and insecurity and transnational drug trafficking, it's a reality since I was a little kid. And one thing that started happening is that hackers, or people who were on cybersecurity, were starting to be hijacked by international organizations. And I think I read the first news about it in 2011. And so there was a group of even it was an investigation from a student at Harvard around the need to protect the people who are working on technology right now, and to talk about to them from one side an ethics, but also their security. This is so a local organization started on protecting these sort of profiles that were on cybersecurity and this sort of information. That's a really concrete example of an organization's working on that, and that's the one that I can recall, because it brings me a lot of memories of how hard the war against drugs has been in Latin America.
Thanks, Laura, and absolutely, it makes this real. I mean, these are, of course, real issues with real impacts for everyone, and technology can really lead to some important shared solutions. I know Elena needs to leave shortly, unfortunately. We'll carry on without her. We'll try our best. But before you go, Elena, I wanted to ask you quickly if you, as you are in some ways, could talk directly to G20 leaders at this point and had 90 seconds to tell them what they needed to do to use technology to better fight corruption. What would you say?
Publish data, and urge governments to publish all the data related to especially spending during the crisis. I think that this pandemic also has negative capacity to actually undermine all the trust that's left in government. And I think that leadership must be focused, or decision makers must be focused on making sure that prevention is key. We have the technology to make the data available. We have the technology to bring it fast to everybody. And I think that things like open data, open contracting should no longer be nice to have for governments. They should be part of the mandatory or the minimum requirements for a government that will want to be part of a new way of doing things. And the new way of doing things also comes with a better awareness of citizens that are looking at the quality of the public services that they receive, the state of the healthcare sectors in the countries that they live in, and citizens are also looking at the capacity of governments nowadays to be transparent about the threats that they face. And I believe that technology can help at least with this part of anti-corruption, with prevention through transparency and openness.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. Thanks for being part of this. Great. I'm going to ask Alan and Laura, ask you that question in a couple of minutes. For those of you watching, we still have a little bit of time. Please put your comments or questions in the chat box if you'd like to ask Alan or Laura anything. But Alan and Laura, one other question that I had was around how we choose technology tools. There was an initiative a few years ago that you may know of called Making All Voices Count. And part of that research looked at how technologists choose tools to fight corruption and ensure citizen participation. And it showed pretty clearly that most people were choosing the tool before they were thinking about what the impact that tool might have would be. So the tool was really the outcome, and then they were kind of working backwards to the issue, rather than, I would argue, the way it should happen, which is, of course, the other way around. You start with the challenge and with the solution you're looking for, and then look at what tools fit with that. And those might be high-tech tools, they might be low-tech, it might be a combination of both. So how do you think we should be choosing these tools? What works in terms of understanding which tools might fit and which might not in any given context?
Well, I believe that tools are tools, and it's important to say that who is behind them and who made it. I think it's an important question. Where is it coming from? With what purpose was it developed? And that's the kind of questions that, as users, as a normal person, you should start to ask yourself whenever you say yes to everything that the free new awesome app or face app it's developing. And also, so how we choose tools, who made it, and what's their purpose. Also to think about systems and not in technologies. I think that we need to see the tools not in what kind of technology is it, but what system are we trying to solve. Another idea that I have is to think on design, but not by defect. It's like to see how these tools can change systems, and also to address that all the technologies have values incorporated in them. If it's developed in America, we'll have an American value, or we'll have the technologies behind them. So I think it's a broader discussion that it's important to leaders to have, and that transformation of leadership should address.
Yeah, I don't really have much more to add other than stray observations that maybe, this is speculation now, but maybe part of that issue is that there are, for the main sort of categories of software that we would use on an everyday basis, only a few options offered by very large companies. So it's just easy to look at what's available and choose one of the three things that are on the shelf. I think there are obviously so many alternatives that exist sort of more on the experimental edges of these things that are great and should be explored. But for most people, it's just easier to look at the big platforms that are there. And I also would say that part of that issue is issues around interoperability and security, and strangely, those things that might actually be better served in the longer term with open source software and those types of alternatives. So it's interesting to see why how the tech giants have somehow managed to defeat those considerations.
Thanks, Alan. And there's another question coming in here from the audience that maybe you're moving towards a little bit with that comment on open source, which is about accessibility. But of course, this idea that ICTs are not necessarily accessible to everyone, including people that aren't as well connected, but also in their design, often with or for people with disabilities and who may not be able to access these tools in quite the same way as others. How have you two seen these tools evolving to ensure greater inclusivity, and what can we do to ensure that happens?
I mean,
it's a hard one.
Just starting to get far beyond my everyday working sort of domains. But I mean, the only thing that comes to mind is you do see advances in this area that respond to consumer demand, and I think that what we just need to be stronger about is articulating those demands and being more forceful and repetitive about them. I just don't have good insights in this area, I'm afraid.
I do work in this area. I could actually talk about it for an hour because it's an issue in Latin America, very strong issue, inclusion. You will say, hey, we have this new great app, and people will say, yeah, but we don't have internet, we just have SMS. So, for example, there was a Monterrey-based technology that allows to send messages even that you don't have sign out through Bluetooth, for example. And the idea behind this is, as I mentioned, in Puentec, we work on inclusion and gender for technology. So we are really interested in understanding access, and we see three phases on this. Inclusion as access, people who have access and the right through ITCs, that they are not that expensive, that they are affordable, that they are inclusive. Second, on usability, people actually do know how to use it. For example, Mexico, it's one of the greatest markets of Netflix in the world. And so we do adapt technology. And we are also one of the greatest users of Facebook and a lot of the American developed technologies. But we know, those platforms are just a very little part of all the opportunities that ITCs give to you, and not even to discuss the fourth industrial revolution. So this part that could be more, so we are working on how, a question that we have is, how do we develop different use of technology? And finally, and third question is, our area is capacity. How do we develop our own Latin American capacity on developers of technology? And how do we make them to stay? I know that I'm abroad from my country, but I stayed them as long as I could. And it's part of the challenges of inclusion. Fourth area, data. Be owner of your own data, and that includes blockchain, using of technologies and other areas.
Thank you, Laura. You touched on something there that I'll ask finally before we close, which is about digital rights. Do you think citizens, both of you, do you think citizens sort of understand their digital rights at the moment? Do they know what their rights are online? And if they don't, how can we better support people to really understand what those rights are?
I think that everybody still struggles understanding what are their rights, not even the digital ones. And that's a reality that we live throughout the world. I think that at the end, technology will affect all of the rights. And I say this because my PhD investigation was on digital identity. I just finished it. It's in Spanish. And I work on and how digital identity was addressed in Mexico. And this part is really important to mention because at the end, technology is not just one industry. It's changing all of them at the same time, very quickly in different areas. So I think that the question is, do we understand how can technology potentiate or affect our rights? And another question will be specifically what is digital rights, because that will be an easy question for 2005, 2010. But right now, so for example, fourth industrial revolution, space, technology, or biotech, what are my rights behind that? Do I have the right to go to space? My granddaughters will have it. I don't know. It's something really that we need to start to raise the questions.
Some big questions, definitely. Alan, I don't know
I think
whether you want to jump in.
Yeah, people have an evolving and a deepening understanding of certain rights. And I'm thinking of sort of consumer rights when it comes to certain commercial operations that happen with tech companies, and also obviously privacy rights that are evolving for a digital age. But I think the more interesting question, this articulation of expectations that we might have, of which there is no real jurisprudence around, because the problems haven't sufficiently materialized yet for us to probably contemplate a policy response. So I'm thinking about things of, particularly deep and sophisticated profiling that allows me to be targeted and influenced in a way that is beyond my contemplation or anyone's real understanding. And I mean, I don't think there is a regulatory framework around those types of issues, because those questions haven't fully materialized and sort of manifested yet. And because obviously without that happening, there's no regulatory response or judicial or legislative response. So I think on that piece, we are in a really difficult place, because people don't know that that's because they just haven't been properly developed yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Some important things for us to think about as this conversation goes forward over the coming years, of course. So to wrap things up, we're running out of time. I wanted to just turn back to you both and ask you the same question that I asked Elena just before she had to leave, which is, if you're talking as you are to G20 leaders about this issue, about how technology can be used to fight corruption, and you had 90 seconds or so, what would you say to them? What are the most important things that they should take into account? Laura, why don't we start with you?
Okay, two big ideas is change in leadership to be responsible, and that means that the future leaders need to understand what we are talking about, what is the fourth industrial revolution, ITCs, and their impact. Second, to adapt and to risk and changes and challenges and pressures. Third, strategy. I don't see national strategies, more from civil, including civil society. Like, for example, there are initiatives that governments present, but I think they're insufficient. We need more like tech diplomacy, for example, seeing it. And second, all that I mentioned around inclusion, access, use, capacity, and bringing your own data.
Thank you, Laura. Some great points in there. Alan, any final thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, this won't be a surprise, I think, but just I would say to work with your communities. I mean, we know that the only way we're going to get through this crisis, to navigate this pandemic, is by doing it together. Working with the communities will build the trust in what you're trying to do, trust in your data and your guidance to get them to do what's right, because it doesn't end for anyone until it ends for everyone. And working with the communities will also improve the efficiency of your policy interventions, both by helping them design better responses and by ensuring accountability in their full and effective implementation.
Thank you, Alan. And I think that's a great place to leave it, working with communities, working together, finding collective solutions to these shared problems. We need to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Alan and Laura, for your inputs. Thanks to Elena again, who had to leave a little bit early. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thanks to you listening in as well. The recording has been made. We can share that. Please follow along on social media at C20 Summit, and please reach out to us individually if you have questions. I think we'd be happy to carry on this conversation online. So thank you so much, everyone. Please tune into other conversations as part of this summit over the next few days, and we'll continue the conversation. Bye-bye.